Listen, we've heard a lot about inflation, of course, but I want to dig a little bit into this. Chair Powell, you recently mentioned that price increases are relatively concentrated in particular areas. And yes, I think most folks can understand that things like airlines and hotels, et cetera, industries that took a hit during COVID, because people weren't really traveling, this could be an issue there. However, I want to get into some other areas where we've seen price increases. One of the biggest areas is in cars, both new and used. And I wanted to touch base about this. Secretary Yellen, one of the key causes of the shortages and the prices of the increase in our cars is because of shortages of semiconductors and production issues. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. There have been significant semiconductor shortages, particularly affecting cars.
Thank you. And I hear regularly from businesses in my district about supply chain issues coming off of the pandemic that are unfortunately holding back our companies. One recently told me that their sales are down $120 million, really because they're producing to supply chain. So, Chair Powell, we see that elsewhere too, with ships waiting offshore on both coasts, difficulties moving goods back and forth, et cetera. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. Very correct. It's hard to see how long that will take, but it will resolve itself in time.
And that shows us also that the prices of shipping goods from China to the U.S. Has gone up, and I think that's gone up 400% from pre-pandemic. So that's going to, of course, add to the cost of anything we buy from China. So while we've got you two here, I guess what I'm wondering about are what are the solutions? Chair Powell, if we have issues with our ports or with the supply of semiconductors or other components, does it make much sense for the economy to pull back on investments in the bottlenecks, or would we do better to expand that capacity?
I think that's really a question for fiscal policy. I will say these are tangled supply chains right now, and it's a combination of a bunch of factors which should abate over time. But in terms of obviously investment in supply chains would make them more efficient over time.
Thank you. And so I want to point out here that most of the things we produce do require workers. And I spoke to you, Chair Powell, about this in February, but Secretary Yellen, you've of course studied labor markets throughout your career. So when we have constraints on our supply chain, does it make sense to limit the numbers of people able to work, or should we instead invest in policies like childcare that help get people into the workforce?
Well, absolutely. I think over the longer term, we've had a problem with declining labor force participation of prime age workers, and we're proposing paid leave, child care support, early childhood education supports that would help expand labor force participation. In the short run, of course, dealing with the pandemic to make sure schools can operate on a normal schedule, get people back to work will help as well.
And then there are other countries around the world that obviously have some of these pieces put in place, like, better child care, early childhood education. In your studies with them, do you see economic growth coming as a result of putting these practices in place?
Yes, it's been an important source of growth in the United States and elsewhere. Once upon a time, the United States, just with respect to women's labor force participation, had about the highest in the world, and that's changed radically in recent decades as we've failed to expand and provide the level of support for female, especially for women's labor force participation. We've fallen behind other developed countries.
Absolutely, and thank you. So what I'm hearing, it sounds like to me that Democrats, what we're proposing is actually a solution to some of these inflation concerns, and that doing nothing will actually exacerbate issues and make it worse. I'm, for one, not in the business of telling people what they can't buy. What I'm hoping that we can do is find solutions like childcare, like paid family leave, like lowering the cost of prescription drugs to keep money in people's pockets so that we can stop artificially limiting the capacity of America's economy and get people back to work to help create more products and move products around our country. So things like childcare, paid leave, and other policies will actually help expand the workforce. Thank you so much.